Hi, welcome back to the Photoshop training channel. I'm Jesus Ramirez. In this video, I'm going to show you all the new features of Adobe Photoshop CC 2019. This will be a comprehensive guide with a ton of information, so make sure that you stick around to the end of the tutorial so that you don't miss a thing. Make sure that you let me know in the comments which was your favorite new feature. Also, if this is your first time at the Photoshop training channel, don't forget to click on that subscribe and notification buttons. Before we get started, I want to mention that I have time codes for each of the features in the description. If you're watching this video on YouTube, then you can click on the time code to jump to that section in the video. Also, check out the links below. I've created a written version of this tutorial. You can find it on my website. And I want to point out that I'm working on a pre-release version of Photoshop CC 2019. That means that I recorded this video before the public release, which means that there's a slight possibility that some things may be a little different on my version. So I just wanted to throw that out there just in case. Okay, let's get started. One of the first things that you will notice in the new Photoshop CC 2019 is the new home screen. This is what it looks like. Let's start by looking at the tour. If you're not familiar with Photoshop, you might want to take a tour. You can click on Take Tour. This will open up this file and the tour in the Learn panel. You can see the Learn panel here on the right, and you can read the instructions and then click on the next button, and Photoshop will highlight different panels and tell you what they do. You can also click on All Projects, hit No, and in the Learn panel, you'll see different tutorials that you can follow along with. When you open up a tutorial, you can follow all the steps. Once you complete the steps, you can actually upload your own image and redo the tutorial with your own images. That way you better understand the concepts. So that's one of the new features in Photoshop CC 2019 inside of the Learn panel. Also, this home button in the options bar, you can click on the home button and go back into the home screen even though a document is open. I also want to point out the Learn tab here on the left-hand side. When you click on that, you'll also have access to all these tutorials. And if you click on Go to Adobe.com, you'll come up to the Photoshop tutorials page on Adobe's website, and you can watch more tutorials. Also, I want to point out that if you go into the Lightroom CC tutorial page, you will see a course that I made, and you can watch that for free. It's on the Lightroom CC tutorials page on the Adobe website. I'll place a link down below in the description, but this is the course, beginner photo editing course. So you can just click on a video, watch it, or follow the written instructions, and you can also download the sample files to follow along. So check them all out. But anyway, back to Photoshop. On the left-hand side, you also have the LR photos. These are actually the Lightroom photos that you have stored on the cloud. So I'm going to go into the home screen, and I want to point out that if you want to disable the home screen, you can do so by pressing Control-K, Command-K on the Mac to bring up the Preferences panel, and then click on Disable the home screen. I like the home screen, so I'll just uncheck it and press OK. Photoshop CC has a lot of new features, but it also changes a lot of the user experience. So I'm going to spend some time now showing you the new user experience improvements. That way you're aware of them before you actually start working on your projects. We're going to start with the modern undo. So I'll create a new adjustment layer and I'll just make a few quick adjustments. Now you can simply press Ctrl-Z to undo changes and Ctrl-Shift-Z to redo. There is no longer the step backward option under the edit menu. Now, Ctrl-Alt-Z, which was the old undo keyboard shortcut, simply toggles the last state. And the menu now reads undo and the name of the command that you're undoing, or redo and the name of the command that you're redoing. So you no longer have to press Ctrl-Alt-Z to undo. You can simply press Ctrl-Z. One of my favorite new features in Photoshop CC 2019 is the blending mode preview. So I have two layers, a dog and this graphic, and now you can click on the drop-down menu to select the blending mode and simply scroll down through the blending modes to get a live preview. So this will make it much faster for you to find the right blending mode for your project. Another change in user experience comes with the transformation. If you press Ctrl-T, Command-T to transform, you'll notice that now you don't have the pivot point or the reference point, as is also known. If you want to enable the reference point, you have to click on this checkbox in the options bar. And there it is. You can of course click and drag it to place it somewhere else, or you can use these boxes to snap the reference point to a particular area. For example, the bottom right corner, here it is. Now I can rotate from that reference point. One of my favorite user experience enhancements in Photoshop CC 2019 is the ability to auto-commit changes by simply clicking outside of object boundaries or anywhere else in the UI when you're working with the crop tool, transformations, place, or text entries. Let me show you what I mean by that. I'm going to select the text tool and I can click on commit and I can add the word auto. And then I'm going to create a line break and I can auto commit this adjustment without clicking on the checkbox by simply clicking outside of that text area. Notice how now that committed the change. I can press the V key on the keyboard to select the move tool and move that text around. You also have this auto commit ability with transformations, Ctrl-T, Command-T to transform. And if I transform the text, I can click outside of that transformation area to commit the change. Same thing is true for the crop tool. Click right outside and it commits the change. And you could also do this with placing objects. So I'm going to click and drag an image from the libraries panel onto my canvas and click right off to the side of that image and it commits the changes. So you no longer have to press enter or return in the Mac to commit changes. One of the biggest changes in Photoshop CC 2019 that you will notice if you've been using Photoshop for a while is the proportional transform. And it can be confusing since it works differently on pixel text layers compared to vector layers. So let me show you what I mean. With a regular image layer selected, you could press Ctrl-T, Command-T to transform. To scale the image, you can click on a corner handle and notice how I can simply scale proportionally without holding the Shift key. In previous versions of Photoshop, you had to hold the Shift key to scale proportionately. Now, if I hold Shift and click and drag on a corner handle, I can do a free scale without scaling proportionately. So that's the biggest change. Now you no longer have to hold the Shift key to scale in proportion. The same thing is true when you're working with a text layer. If I press Ctrl-T, Command-T to transform, I can click and drag on a corner handle and I scale the image in. If I hold Alt, Option on the Mac as I'm scaling, I scale in and out of the reference point. The reference point is currently in the center, so I go in and out from that reference point right here. Now the confusing part is that when you're working with a vector layer, it works differently. If you press Ctrl-T, Command-T to transform, and you click and drag on a corner handle, I'm not scaling in proportion. If I want to scale in proportion with a vector layer, I have to hold Shift, then scale in proportion. So I think that this is where the confusing part will come into play, since scaling in proportion works differently with different layers, whereas before, it worked the same on all layers. So keep this in mind in case the layers are not transforming the way that you're expecting them to. Photoshop CC 2019 now truncates long layer names differently. I have some long layer names in this image, and if I click and drag the panels, you'll see that the layer names are truncated. Now they truncate from the middle so that you can see the beginning of the layer name and the ending. In old versions of Photoshop, the truncation happened at the end, so you could only see the beginning part of the layer. If the beginning part of all your layers was the same, it was difficult to tell which layer was which, but now you can see the ending of the layer name as well. In Photoshop CC 2019, the text tool gives you a new feature. When you select the type tool, you can click to type, and in this new version, you will see dummy text appear immediately. This is to give you a preview of the size of the text, and you can of course come in and adjust the size and the font if you wish. And when you're ready, you can start typing anything that you like. Once again, you can commit the changes by clicking outside of the text, and there it is. Also, since we're talking about text, another new feature in Photoshop CC 2019 is that with the Move tool selected, you can double click on a piece of text and you can enter the edit mode and adjust the text if you need to. So those were some of the user experience enhancements in Photoshop CC 2019. Now let's focus on the new features. We'll start with the small ones and we'll end with the biggest features, so stick around to the end. Photoshop CC 2019 is a great new feature for those of you who are compositing and retouching in Photoshop. So I have a composite that I made here, and sometimes when you're working on a composite or retouching, you need to look at an image in a different way so that you can spot mistakes. Before, you could go into Image, Image Rotation, and flip the canvas horizontally. And this would actually transform the pixels and flip them horizontally. As you saw, there was a render bar, so it took some time for Photoshop to generate the transformation. And that was an actual transformation. I actually transformed the pixels. I'm going to undo that. In Photoshop CC 2019, you do not have to transform the pixels. All you have to do is go into View and select Flip Horizontal. And this flips the image horizontally, but it's only a preview. I didn't actually change the pixels. If I were to close the file, save it, and open it again, you'll notice that the file has not been rotated. It was just a preview rotation, and it happens much faster than actually flipping the image horizontally. So take advantage of that if you're compositing or retouching images in Photoshop. Photoshop CC 2019 has a new capability for distributing objects across your canvas. Now, distributing objects is not a new feature. What's new is the spacing. Let me show you what I mean by that. I have 4 objects on my canvas and I can select them all by clicking on the top one, holding Shift, and clicking on the bottom one, and that selects them all. With the Move tool selected, I can then click on the distribute icons, which are found here. New to this version of Photoshop is 2 icons. This icon, which is distribute spacing vertically and distribute spacing horizontally, and this 3-dot icon that shows you all the buttons. So what was in the old version of Photoshop was that you can click on this icon to distribute the objects in between the 2 objects on the far end. Now, if I select the cat, then hold Control, Command on the Mac, and hover over the phone, you'll see that the distance between the cat and the phone is 169 pixels. The distance between the cat and the star is 154 pixels. So the spacing is not the same. If I select the star and then select the paw, you'll see that the spacing between those two is 108 pixels. Even though the objects were distributed in between the 2 layers, the spacing is not the same. So that's where this new tool comes in. If I select the top layer, hold Shift, click on the bottom one, and then go into this icon, I can select Distribute Spacing Horizontally, which is the same as this icon here. So I can click on that, the icons shift, and if I select the cat, hold Control, Command on the Mac, you'll see that the space in between the cat and the phone is now 144 pixels. So the objects were distributed equally amongst themselves. And of course, the same thing will be true if I were to use the vertical alignment. And this option selects what you're aligning to, the selection or the canvas. Photoshop CC 2019 now allows you to do basic math in input boxes. This is on all input boxes. Let me show you what I mean by that. I can select any input box like the opacity input box, and I can do a mathematical equation. So I can do 100 minus 38, hit enter, and that gives me the result, which is 62%. If I press Ctrl T, Command T to transform, and go up into the scale input boxes in the options bar, I can do a mathematical equation. For example, 100 times 0.27, hit enter, and that gives me 27%. Obviously, this feature becomes more useful with different numbers, not 100, because that's really easy to do in your head. But you can see the power of being able to do mathematical equations on input boxes. You can add, subtract, divide, and multiply. In Photoshop CC 2019, you get a useful new feature, the ability to lock workspaces. You might accidentally click and drag a panel away, and it could be confusing or time-consuming to bring it back into place. In order to prevent panels from moving, you can go into Window, Workspace, and at the very bottom of the list, click on Lock Workspace. This will prevent panels from moving, but you can still resize the panels if you need to. A great new feature in Photoshop CC 2019 for selecting color is the Color Wheel Color Picker. If you go into Window, Color, you get the color panel. Clicking on the flyout menu will now give you access to a color wheel. You can click on it and you can use this color wheel to select the color. Clicking around the wheel selects the hue. Moving up and down on the triangle controls the brightness, and moving left to right on the triangle controls the saturation. Using the color wheel helps you select complementary colors much easier. For example, if I have blue selected, I can look at the opposite side of the wheel and see what colors are complementary to blue. So yellow and orange, of course. Photoshop CC 2018 introduced the Symmetry Tool as a technology preview, but it is now a full feature in Adobe Photoshop CC 2019. If you select the Brush tool in the options bar, you'll see the Symmetry icon. Clicking on it will show you a drop-down where you can select a symmetry. If I click on vertical, it'll create a vertical symmetry. And what that means is that I have this line here and I'm going to paint on this blank layer. Symmetry allows you to paint in a mirror, like so, to create very interesting designs. And you have a lot of options of how you want to create those designs. For example, you can use a spiral and simply paint in on that spiral. I'm going to undo that. One of my favorites is the radial. You can select the number of segments. We'll start with 5 and press OK. And I can simply start painting and creating really interesting designs like so. And of course, you can spend a lot of time with these designs. They're really fun. So I'm going to press the V key just so that we can hide the overlay. And that's my design. I'm going to undo that, and I'm now going to try a different symmetry. So I'm going to select the brush tool, and I'm going to try the mandala, and I'll increase the segments to 8, press OK, and I can paint inside of that, and you start creating these really cool designs really quickly using the Symmetry tool. So it's now a full feature. You do not need to enable it in the technology preview. In Photoshop CC 2019, you now have extra features in the keyboard shortcuts menu. As you may know, you can apply your own keyboard shortcuts to all the tools and menus inside of Photoshop, but now you can also add keyboard shortcuts to your task spaces. That includes the selected mask and the new content-aware fill. I'll talk about the new content-aware fill tool next, but I'm just letting you know in advance that you can assign your own keyboard shortcuts to the tools inside of that task space. Photoshop CC's 2019's biggest and best feature is perhaps the new content-aware fill. The previous version of content-aware fill didn't give you many options besides a layer mask hack that you probably saw in one of my older tutorials, and this new version of Photoshop gives you complete control over how content-aware fill works, and it allows you to work non-destructively. Let me first show you how the old content-aware fill used to work. It's still available in Photoshop CC 2019 in case you want to use it. So the way it worked is that you would create a selection. I'm using the lasso tool for that. Then you would go into the Edit menu, select Fill, and under Contents, you would select Content Aware and check on the box. Press OK, and Photoshop would analyze the pixels surrounding the selection and use those pixels to fill it in. So I'm going to zoom in so that you can see. It was a pretty good fill, but it's not perfect as you can see. Also, you notice that we had no options. The only way that we were able to alter what Photoshop was sampling was by using a layer mask. Now, in the new version of Photoshop, you have complete control over the content-aware fill. So what I'm going to do is simply press Ctrl Z to undo. Then I'm going to go into Edit, Content-aware fill. This is the new feature in Photoshop CC 2019. You'll notice that it's a complete workspace that gives us a toolbar, the working document, a preview of what we're doing, and options for the content that we're filling. Just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I'm going to reset the options, and I'm just going to collapse these panels just so that we're all looking at the same thing and there's nothing else distracting us. We're going to start with the toolbar. On the left-hand side, you have different tools. The ones that you probably know how to use are the hand tool, which allows you to click and pan on the image, and the zoom tool, which allows you to zoom in or zoom out. You can zoom out by holding Alt Option on the Mac and clicking. You can also click and drag for the scrubby zoom. Just make sure that this box is checked. Otherwise, when you click and drag, you would create a box that will zoom in into that area. If you click on scrubby zoom and click and drag, you zoom in and out. So use the feature that best works for you. You then, of course, have the 100% view, fit screen, and fill screen buttons. But in most cases, you'll probably just use the zoom tool. I like to use the spacebar, so hold the spacebar and click and drag to use the pan tool. The next tools in this panel help you control what Photoshop is sampling. So the first tool, the sampling brush tool, allows you to remove the areas that Photoshop is going to sample from. Notice that when I do that, Photoshop automatically updates the preview. You'll notice a rotating circle. That means that Photoshop is generating the preview. You will also notice a warning icon. That means that you're looking at a low resolution preview, but once Photoshop generates a high resolution preview, that warning will go away, and that's what you're going to be seeing in the preview window. So watch what happens. I'm going to paint, release the mouse button. Photoshop will analyze the image. Once the warning icon is gone, then that's when you're looking at the full resolution preview. By the way, just to be clear, anything that is in green is what Photoshop is using to analyze this image. When I paint, I remove from those areas that Photoshop is analyzing from. Also notice that currently the subtraction button is enabled. If I hold Alt Option on the Mac, it switches over into the add mode so I can add to the sampling area. If I had the add enabled, when I paint, I add, and when I hold Alt Option on the Mac, I subtract. So pay attention to the buttons that you have selected, and then just realize that holding the Alt key will select the opposite. When you release, it will return to the selected one. And of course, you can control the size of the brush with this dropdown. Then we have the lasso tool and polygonal lasso tool. Notice that when we select either of these tools, we get more options in the options bar. This tool allows us to add to the fill area. And notice that the preview generates automatically, or we can subtract from it by holding Alt and Option on the Mac. So something that I would recommend is making your initial selection. Once you're inside of the content-aware workspace, just refine it. So I always like to keep as much of the original pixels as possible. So I'm refining the selection like so. You don't have to be very precise, but just make adjustments to the selection so that it works on your image. You also have this feather option. Right now I have a feather set to 2 pixels. That simply means that the edge is not sharp. It's going to be blurry by 2 pixels. I like having just a slight feather just so that there are no sharp lines when I'm filling. So my feather is set to 2, but you can change it to whatever works in your case. Then we have these buttons that I actually wish I could see outside of this tool because I really like them. We have the expand and contract. Expand simply means that the selection is going to expand, and contract means we're going to make it smaller. Notice how that changed that area here, so I can just come in and just fill that in and hold Alt Option the Mac and subtract. And by the way, we're expanding and contracting by 3 pixels because that is the number on this dropdown. Also, something I want to point out is that if I were to paint with the brush tool, like for example, remove the sampling area from the top there, and I expanded my selection, then contracted my selection, notice how the green comes back. So keep an eye out for that. But anyway, now that you know how the tools work, let's look at the image, see the preview, and see how we can improve it with the options available. So what I'm going to do first is just click on the zoom tool, fit the image on screen, And I'm just going to paint the areas away that I don't want Photoshop to sample. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit and keep an eye out for the changes that occur here. I don't want Photoshop to waste time looking at pixels that it shouldn't use for the fill. So I'm just going to subtract the sky because I really don't want much of the sky to be used. And I accidentally deleted too much from the water. I actually do want part of the water because as you can see, he's running and we can see the horizon line and a little bit of the sky. So I can always add in case I make a mistake like I just did there. So I'm just adding these pixels in. Also, I don't want these reflections, so I'm going to subtract all this from the sampling area. And it looks like I accidentally zoomed in, so let me just set that back to 100% and maybe even zoom out just a little bit further. Sorry about that, I accidentally zoomed in, but anyway, here we are. And it's looking much better. So what I'm going to do now is explain what all these options do. Show sampling area simply means show the green areas, what we're sampling. That's all that does. Then we have the sampling options. In the sampling options, you can reduce the opacity of that green. I like 50%, so that's where I'll leave it. You could also change the color to something else, so maybe red, yellow, whatever works for your image. The default green works great in this example. And then what it indicates. In this case, it's indicating what Photoshop is sampling to generate the fill. You could also select excluded areas, so the areas that Photoshop is not analyzing. In this case, sampling areas works, so that's what I'll select. Then we have the fill settings, and this is where the real power of the new content-aware fill comes in. Let's start with color adaptation. Color adaptation allows contrast and brightness to adapt for a better match. Good for filling contents with gradual color or texture changes. So you can just click on the drop down and select the different settings. Notice when I select the setting, it automatically changes the preview. And I can just click on these and see if any of these give me a better result. For an image like this, I think that the default setting is perhaps the best, but you can switch them around in your image to see what works better. Also, we have rotation adaptation. Rotation adaptation allows the content to rotate for a better match. It's good for filling content with rotated curves or patterns. In this case, it can actually help us align these lines that you see there. So I can just select something like medium and see how that adjusts the rotation. That might be too much, so maybe bring it down to low and see how that works. It's really doing a lot of damage here in the horizon, so maybe leaving it at none is probably best. And I can then use the other options, for example, scale. Scale allows the content to resize for a better match. It's good for filling content with repeating patterns of different sizes or under perspective. So if I click on that, notice how it matches the lines much better. We also have the mirror option, which simply allows the horizontal flip of content for a better match. So I can click on that and see if it makes any change. And it does, but I'm not happy with it, so I'll return back to mirror. Now that I've made all these adjustments, I can actually come back and see if color adaptation gives me better results by using high or very high. And I actually kind of like that, so I'll leave it at very high. Now that I've made all these changes, I can select the output settings. How do I want to output this adjustment? On a duplicate layer, meaning I'll duplicate the original and apply the change, or I can simply create a new layer and fill those pixels in that have changed on that layer or on the current layer. I like working non-destructively, so I'll select either new layer or duplicate layer. In this case, new layer will work, so I'll select that, then I'll press OK. Notice that a new layer was created with that pixel information, and I'll zoom in so that you can see it. There it is, and you can see the result. I'm going to press Ctrl D, Command D to deselect. The great thing about using a layer is that you can also create a layer mask and then paint with black in areas to reveal some of the original pixels in case you need to. In this case, we don't need to, but that option is there. Now, I know that that was sort of a long-winded explanation of how the tool works, but now I want to show you the real power of this tool by showing you a few more examples. So I'm going to go into this image here, which will really show the power of this tool. So I'm going to zoom in to this area here. And if I wanted to remove this band from the image, I would need to make a selection around it, of course. I already have a pre-made selection just to save time, so I'm going to go into Select, Load Selection, and I'll select the selection titled Van and press OK. It's just a selection, that's all it is. I just made a selection before I started the tutorial to save some time. And if I were to select the background layer, use the keyboard shortcut Shift and Backspace to bring up the fill window, and select Content Aware, you will see that the original Content Aware fill wouldn't work because it's sampling all these pixels from different areas. And again, there was a masking hack that you can use to force Photoshop to use certain pixels, but now we don't have to worry about that. So I'm going to undo that fill and then just go into Edit, Content Aware Fill, and I'm going to find that van, there it is, and I'm just going to make a couple of changes to the selection. So I'm going to select the lasso tool, and I'm just going to remove some pixels that I want to keep. Something like that. Maybe I'll remove some of these, so I'll click and drag to remove some of these pixels as well. There it is. Now, if I click on the reset button on all these, I can zoom in and find that area. Here it is. So Photoshop is not doing that good of a job, of course, because I'm selecting all these different pixels that really don't have anything to do with the background that I'm trying to replace. So I'm going to zoom out, and I'm just going to paint with this brush, and I'm just going to subtract all the pixels that are not necessary to sample from. So all these pixels here are really not necessary for the sample. And notice that as I'm doing that, the preview is updating and it's already giving me much better results. And continue to paint areas away that don't work for the sample source, like these areas here. And also I'm going to zoom in so that you could see what I'm doing. So I'm just trying to keep the pixels that look a lot like the areas that will be under that van. And if you see any problem areas, then try to find them on the pixels that Photoshop is sampling, and then just simply paint those out. So I think that's already pretty good. And then of course I can use all these different settings, like maybe try scale and see how that works. That looks pretty good. Maybe mirror, flip things around and see if that gives us any better result. If they don't, then uncheck them and continue fine-tuning the different settings to get a good result. I don't think I need to rotate pixels in this case, so I'll just bring it back to none. And what I'll do is I'll just keep looking for the best areas to sample pixels from. Maybe I'll remove some of these pixels. And I think that something like this could work, so I can just press OK. And notice now how that's a much better fill than what Photoshop gave me with the old Content Aware fill. And of course, it's on its own layer. And you can always come in and fine-tune it if you need to. I'm going to show you another quick example just to show you different ways that this tool works. So if I wanted to keep this pattern as a design, but I wanted to remove this person's hand, let me show you how you could do that. I could simply make a quick selection using the lasso tool around that area, like so, and actually maybe even fine-tune it a little bit before we go into the Content Aware fill. Let me show you what the old Content Aware fill looks like. So I'm going to hold Shift and Backspace to bring it up, and I already have it selected, so I'll press OK. And you can see that it didn't do that good of a job. So now I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to go into Edit, Content Aware Fill, and you'll see the results there. I'll zoom in so that you could better see the results. And I can start telling Photoshop what not to sample. I don't want any of this center area to be sampled. I obviously don't want his hand to be sampled, so I'm just painting those away, just so that we work with the areas that we really want. Then I can start fine-tuning the image. I know that I want scale enabled because I want Photoshop to be able to resize some of those pixels so that it fits better. I know that maybe mirroring could work, so I'll check mirror. And notice that by doing that, the image is starting to look much, much better. See that? And then I can adjust color adaptation, rotation adaptation, and see if that works. I'll leave color adaptation to default for now, and I'll start changing the rotation adaptation settings to see if it gives me a better result. And even though this is not perfect, it's still looking pretty good. So I'll just keep adjusting the settings and see if they make any more positive changes. Setting it to high is pretty good. looking at this area here and I'm not liking what's going on there. So what I'll do is I'll adjust the selection. So maybe I'll subtract from this area and see if it improves it. And it's much better. It's not perfect, but I think it's better. And I just want to make it clear that you'll probably never get a perfect fill with a complicated pattern like this, but you can already see the power of content aware because I can press OK, I get a new layer, and then I can start working on the finer details. So one of the things that I could do is maybe make an elliptical marquee selection, hold the space bar so that I can move the selection as I'm creating it, and I can right click on it and select transform selection. That's something that a lot of people don't know. It allows me to transform the selection as I'm creating it, and I can distort it and also use the warp to warp it so that it fits the area that I'm trying to select. So I'm just trying to select around these golden circles. And again, it's not important to get a perfect selection on this example, so I'll just stop it here and just create a layer mask and then clip this fill layer to it. Control-Alt-G, Command-Option-G on the Mac. And there it is. All you would need to do now is simply come in and fine-tune the finer details to make sure that areas like this are fixed, which is a lot easier than filling the rest. And if you're wondering how to do that, there's a lot of ways. You can clone, for example. So I can take from that area and start cloning things away and just fine-tune it as best as you can. Also, I'm going to delete this layer, and I just want to show you one other thing. If you have a layer mask active and you use the content aware fill, then those areas will not be visible and you will not be able to use them as the source in the fill. So I'm not really looking for settings that work. I just wanted to show you that you could also make a fill when you have a layer mask active and how that feature reacts to it. Photoshop CC 2019 introduces the brand new frame tool. It's the newest addition to the toolbar. You can see it here. This is the frame tool. You can select it by clicking on it or pressing K on the keyboard. The frame tool allows you to create placeholder images, and you can easily replace the contents in the future. If you've ever used a frame tool in Adobe InDesign, then you're probably already familiar with the function. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you two examples so that you understand why you would want to use this tool. But before we get into that, I'm just going to start with a very basic example so that you understand how the tool works. Then we'll worry about why you want to use it. In this image, I have a blank layer, a fill layer for a background so I can change the color if I want to, and then a pixel layer and a smart object. So I'm going to disable all the layers and then just work with my background and this blank layer. Then with the frame tool selected, you can look at the options bar and decide if you're going to create a rectangular frame or an elliptical frame. Let's start with a rectangular frame. So I'll select that. Then I'm just going to click and drag in the canvas. Notice that in the layers panel, now I have a new layer type. This is a frame layer. I can tell that it's a frame layer because I can see this icon here on the bottom right that indicates that this is a frame. It's simply a square with an X on it, which looks a lot like the frame that I have here. So this frame is an image placeholder. And what that means is that I can go into my libraries panel and I can click and drag any image I want onto it. Notice that the image was automatically resized to fit the height of the frame. Notice the layers panel. There's this white focus, this white outline that is really important when working with a frame layer because you can either affect the frame, the content inside of the frame, or if I hold shift and click on both, I can adjust both at the same time. So first I'm just going to select the content, the image. If I press Ctrl-T, Command-T to transform, I can of course move it and transform it. If I click outside the bounding box, I commit the changes. You can see the outline of the image here. If I wanted to fit the image onto the frame again, I cannot do it automatically. I have to do it by hand, so I would have to press Ctrl-T, Command-T to transform and try to match it. Also, I can click on the frame. Notice the white outline on the frame. Then I can click and drag on the corner handles to adjust the shape of the frame. If I hold Shift and click on the frame and then the content, the image, and press Ctrl-T, Command-T to transform, I can scale both at the same time. Frames were designed to be used with images and smart objects. Currently, the content is a smart object, but it's actually linked to the cloud, which is why you see this icon here. I'm going to delete this frame. Then I'm going to select the elliptical frame, click and drag to create one, and notice that we now have a circle. If I disable the background, enable this pixel layer, I can click and drag it onto the frame and notice that it gets placed inside of it. Also notice that this time it was not automatically resized because we brought it in from the layers panel. If I were to bring it from an external source like the libraries panel or a file in my computer, it will resize it accordingly. So just note the difference. Also notice another thing that happened. This became a smart object, which means that we can transform it non-destructively. So I can scale it way down if I want to, and then scale it up again, and I will not get any pixelation because smart objects allow me to work non-destructively. That also means that I can double click on this smart object and it opens up in a new tab, and I can make an adjustment layer like a gradient map adjustment layer, and I'll change it to a different color just so that you could see. And I can close it, save it, and it gets applied onto my frame. I can also, of course, use a filter. So maybe filter, stylized, find edges. And here it is. Here's my find edges filter. And of course, I can click and drag it into the trash icon to delete it. So I'm just making it clear that it's a regular smart object inside of that frame now. Also, you can work with a smart object directly. So I have this smart object here. If I double click on it, you can see what it looks like. I have an adjustment layer, I have this layer, and the background. Another way of creating a frame is by simply clicking and dragging over an image or a smart object, and that creates the frame. So frames only work with images, smart objects, not vectors, not text layers, or any other kind of layer. Also, if you don't have a frame selected and you have the frame tool selected, you can click once to select the frame, double click to select the contents. Notice the white outline, the focus. When I double clicked on it, it moved over onto the content. When the content is selected, if I double click on it again, it selects both the content and the frame, and I can adjust them accordingly. Also, if I have the content selected, I can select the frame by clicking once on the outline, and that selects the frame, and I can adjust the frame if I need to. So this is just a basic example of how the frame tool works. So what I'm going to do now is show you a couple projects that will demonstrate how this tool works. So I'm going to go into this example. And in the old days, if you're designing a website or any type of design, sometimes the images will not be ready in time. So you might be waiting for a photographer, for a designer, or somebody to create an image. So what you would do is just create a placeholder image. So in this case, I have these images as placeholders. And what you would do is delete these images and replace them with the final images when they came in. So what I'll do now is just delete this group because we don't need it. And what the frame tool is designed to do is to create those placeholder images, but then make them smart so that you could easily update the content. So I'm going to click on the rectangular option, and I'm going to click and drag to make my frame. There it is. I can give it a name if I want to. And I'm just going to create all these frames. And that's all I need to do. Now, instead of deleting the frames and replace it with the final content, I can actually drag and drop the final content onto the frames. So, as you saw, I can go into a libraries panel and I can click and drag an image onto a frame and adjust it accordingly. I could also, from the properties panel, select a frame and use the insert image command to find an image to place onto that frame. I can select find on Adobe Stock, which opens up a browser on the Adobe Stock website, and you can find images there. You can select open libraries, which simply opens the libraries panel. You could also place from local disk, either as an embedded file or linked. Embedded files simply means that the file will be embedded into your working Photoshop document. Linked means that Photoshop will reference an external file, so it will not be embedded into the working Photoshop document. So I'll select the embedded option for this example. And in this folder, I have an image of me that I can select and click on place. And of course, I can click and drag it and adjust it accordingly, but I'm not going to waste any time for that in this example because it's not necessary. I do want to point out the other options inside of the properties panel. I also have the ability to add a stroke, so I can just select the color for my stroke, then select a width, and then select a placement, so either inside, center, or outside. Then we have layer comps. These are very powerful, so I'll come back to those in just a second. I'll explain commands first. Command gives us two buttons, Edit Contents and Convert to Linked. If I click onto Edit Contents, it just opens up my smart object and I can edit it if I need to. That's the same thing as double clicking on the smart object. Convert to Linked will open the Save As window so that we can save this embedded object as an external file. So to do that, I would have to give it a name, so I can just call it image. The name is not important. Save it. Notice that the icon changes from smart object to a little chain icon, which means that this is now a linked object. So when I double click on it and open it, I'm opening up that external file. And now that this is a linked smart object, I have a button that reads embedded. So if I click on it, it now converts it into a smart object inside of this document. So that's what those buttons do. So we're now going to talk about the layer comp, which is a really powerful feature. So what I'm going to do is go into File, New, and just click on Create, and I have a document. And I'm just going to place several images onto this document. The images are really not that important. I just want to have 3 different images so that you can see how this works. So I have 3 images and they're covering the entire document. And again, the content is really not that important. So with these 3 images selected, I'm going to go into Window, Layer Comps. Layer Comps allow you to basically create a screenshot of your layers panel. You can control the visibility of the layer, the position, and layer styles, which includes blending modes. In this case, to make things very simple, we're going to create layer comps that simply control the visibility of the layers. So what I'm going to do is click on this new icon and the new layer comp window will come up. And I can choose what to say, visibility, position, or appearance. In this case, we're only going to worry about visibility. So I'll call this layer comp alley. I'll disable the alley image and enable the image below. This next layer comp I will call cracks, and this final layer comp I will call beach. Then I can save this image, File, Save As, and I can just call it main graphic. So I'm going to close it, go back into my working design, and I can click on the frame for this main graphic here. Then I can go into the properties panel and click on Place from Local Disk Embed, and I can open that main graphics.psd file I just created and click on Place, and there it is. If I click on this frame, then go into the properties panel, you can see that in the layer comp section, I have this drop down and I can select the alley, cracks, and beach. So I can select alley and it changes to the photo of the alley. I can select cracks and it changes into the photo of the cracks. And I can select beach and it changes into the photo of the beach, obviously. So it's a very powerful feature that you can use with frames, layer comps, and smart objects. In this next example, I'm going to show you how you can create frames from text and shape layers. So I have this shape layer here. If I select the direct selection tool, you can see that it's simply a shape. And if I disable this pixel layer and right click on that shape, I can select Convert to Frame. Give it a name if you want to and press OK. And that shape is now a frame. That means that I can go into the Libraries panel and simply click and drag an image onto that frame. and place that image on that frame. You can do the same thing with a text layer. So with this text layer selected, I can right click and select Convert to Frame, give it a name if you want to, and press OK. And that is now a frame as well. So I can select a different image, drag and drop it onto that frame. Now, to be frank with you, I probably wouldn't use the text feature simply because I like flexibility and I like to work non-destructively. I can't change the text if I made a typo or if my client wants me to change the text, so it'll create more work. So I'll show you what I like to do instead. I'm going to press Ctrl Z several times to undo those changes. And I'm simply going to drag that same image and drop it right above that layer. Then I'm simply going to press Ctrl Alt G, Command Option G on the Mac to create a clipping mask, and that gives me exactly the same effect. The advantage is that I can double click on the layer and change the word to something else. And I can resize it as well, of course. So you have a little more flexibility when you're working with clipping masks and text. But using the frame feature is yet another option that Photoshop gives you to work with text and images. And there it is. I hope that all these Photoshop CC 2019 tutorials helped you understand the new features. Let me know in the comments down below which one was your favorite. Also, if this is your first time at the Photoshop training channel, then don't forget to click on that subscribe and notification buttons. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you at the next tutorial.